Hello, everyone. Can we give Amy Gallo a very warm Seattle welcome?
I think you can tell by how we're dressed who lives in Seattle and who doesn't. I thought it might be a little warmer here.
No, it's November in Seattle. We have an amazing crowd out here, given the weather and everything else. I'm so excited you're here, Amy. Thank you, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. So Amy and I are good friends, and so you might hear, a couple of teasing jokes and things like that. That's just how we roll. I'm not trying to be a difficult person, and I'll try my best anyway. All right, so. Amy, you and I both love reading, and one of the things I've noticed when you read a book that you're like, this is amazing, what I think is you get the sense that the author had like this fire in their belly, like there was this moment that was like, I need to write this book, and it just really comes through on the page, which it really does in your book. And so I'm wondering, what was that moment for you?
Oh, this book has been a long time in the making, and this very funny thing happened actually where I had this book idea about 6 years ago, and I sat on it for a long time because I was really busy, as many of us are, and I finally, when the pandemic hit, I had some free time, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write that book proposal. Sold the book, wrote it, it came out, and a lot of the questions have been, how did you write such a timely book? And I'm like, well, it's meant to be evergreen. So, the spark for this book came, there are several moments I can point to. One is when I had the most difficult boss I've ever worked with. I talk about her in the introduction. And I was stumped on how to deal with her at the time. I didn't do a great job of it, which I talk about again in the introduction. And I really looked for advice on how to deal with her, and I couldn't find it. And so that was one moment where I thought, oh gosh, someone's got to write a book about this. Someone needs to give me the advice I need. The other moment was sitting actually I did a talk at a big conference. There were about 3,000 people in the room, lots of great questions afterwards. And someone came up to me as I was leaving the event and said, I had a question, but I didn't want to ask it in front of a bunch of people. And I was speaking then about my book about conflict. And she said, everything you shared is so helpful. Thank you so much. But let me tell you about this one coworker. And she described this person who I, again, was completely stumped. And I said, yeah, I've been studying this topic for almost a decade now. I write about how to deal with conflict at work, and I don't have great advice for you, but I will get back to you. And that was now 8 years later. I hope she's gotten the book. I've lost her name. But the problem I was trying to solve with this book is sleepless nights. And I know I've had so many sleepless nights dealing with people who I work with. I've heard about sleepless nights that people have. I still have some of those sleepless nights, even though I wrote this book. So I was really trying to help people get the advice they need that wasn't yet out there, and get the advice that was specific to the type of behavior that they were dealing with. I didn't want to give sort of generic advice that should apply to everyone, but really specific advice depending on the behavior that you're dealing with.
Thank you, Amy. I was really worried for a second you were going to be like, the time I edited this author called Ruchika Tulshyan for an article. But, so you have 8 archetypes in the book, and actually the one I wanted to start with is something that no Seattleite will ever be familiar with, which is the passive-aggressive person. I know, nobody here. We're like,
I can tell by the reaction,
Yeah,
this is not something any of you deal with, right?
None of us.
So this is a great archetype to start with because it was the impetus for the book. And that the question, that person who asked me about their specific coworker, one of the many difficult behaviors that their coworker was exhibiting was passive aggressiveness. It's the question I get asked the most. I can tell you whether I'm doing a Zoom presentation, whether I'm doing an in-person presentation, it's the first, second, or third question is how do I deal with someone who's behaving passive-aggressively? So it's the first chapter I wrote. I actually thought for a moment the book would be all about dealing with passive-aggressive people, and then I realized there's just many other behaviors we have to deal with. So, I'll walk you through, because each of the archetype chapters have common behaviors of that archetype. What might be motivating some of that behavior? What's behind it? What are some questions you have to ask yourself about it? And then what are some tactics that you can try? And so I probably don't have to tell you the common behaviors from the way you responded, but saying one thing, then doing the opposite, displaying body language that indicates one emotion, and then when you ask, "Are you okay?" say, "No, I'm fine." All right. Promising to do something they never do, like sending that email. Just behavior where what Gabe Adams, who's a professor at University of Virginia, who I interviewed for this chapter, who studies, does academic studies about passive-aggressive behavior, calls it, defines it as not being forthcoming about your thoughts or feelings, and instead expressing them in indirect ways. So some of the reason someone might behave passive-aggressively, and most of the time what Gabe finds, and actually in her research, and other researchers find as well, is it's not an intentional behavior. Like no one goes home and says, "How was your day today?" And they say, "Great, I behaved passive-aggressively. It was really effective." Right? They think, well, I was being petty, or it's not safe to say what I actually think, or they asked me a question, I wanted to tell them what I really felt, but I didn't feel comfortable doing it. And that's not to say there aren't people who are manipulative and are bad actors, so to speak, but more often than not, it comes from either being afraid of conflict, afraid of rejection, afraid of failure, right? It's all these sort of fears or desire for perfection, desire to be liked. And oftentimes, one of the things we really need to keep in mind, it's also feeling like people don't have power or authority to express how they feel. And so we often see people from underestimated groups use passive aggression because it's not safe for them to say exactly what they think and feel in a direct manner. It can also be cultural. You may be from a region, say Seattle, where it's a very typical behavior that there's this expectation that you'll be kind and nice, even if you don't feel that way towards someone. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what are the tactics? How do I deal with this? In all of the chapters, when I talk about tactics, I really aim to give you a menu of tactics. This is not a book where you'll get the 5-step process to deal with your passive-aggressive peer. Distrust those books, by the way, because there is no 5-step process to dealing with other humans. They're messy. We're all messy. We show up with lots of baggage in our interactions. There's not going to be a clear-cut silver bullet way of dealing with these folks. So it's a menu of options you have to try out. And those options tend to fall into one of two categories. They're more subtle approaches, strategies. For example, with the passive-aggressive person, you can try to make it safe for them to actually say what they think and feel. So explain that it's okay to disagree, set norms on a team, we'll say what we mean, we'll mean what we say, right? Those are sort of more subtle. And then there's more direct, where you can say, you agreed to help out with this project. We've had 3 meetings. You haven't shown up to any of them. If you're not able to help out, please tell me so, right? That's a much more direct way. And the reason I offer different approaches is that we know that there is narrower ranges of acceptable behavior for certain people at work. So me, as a white woman, might have an easier time calling out behavior directly than Ruchika might as a brown woman. And so I want to make sure that people have both tactics that they feel comfortable with, but that they also will not be penalized for using in their own contexts.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think one thing that I found very groundbreaking in your book was that specific acknowledgement throughout the book about how bias plays into whom we consider, sometimes who we might perceive as a difficult person, right? So, for example, stereotypes exist. I research and talk about stereotypes and bias in the workplace. We know that, for example, Asian women, which I identify as an Asian woman, are stereotyped as being quiet, submissive. So if we run counter to that stereotype, oh, she's so difficult. I've been called difficult, defensive, all of those things in the workplace. We know that's true for Black women. We know that's true for other women of color too. What I really appreciate is you staying that up front. Mm-hmm. It's a fact, and I appreciate that you talk about it. What advice would you give to dealing with, if you're dealing with a coworker who's displaying bias towards you? How do we deal with that?
Yeah. And that's one of the archetypes, is the biased coworker.
Right.
Your advice is very much featured in that chapter. Thank you. And actually, before I answer that, I want to talk about that term "difficult people" for a moment. Right. It's on the cover of the book. I have very mixed feelings about using it, because it's labeling people as difficult, which is something, if you read the book, is not really what I'm discussing. We had a lot of debate with my editor and the commercial team at Harvard Business Review Press about whether to include that. And ultimately, which I thought was really good advice, is they said the people who are looking for the advice in your book think they are dealing with difficult people. And you could put quotes around that, but that will confuse them, that will make them feel like they're not seen. So let's help them feel seen for what they're experiencing, and then give them the advice. And even that term "difficult" is laden with bias. Yes. So we are all have a strong tendency to like and affiliate ourselves with people who look, sound, have similar backgrounds to us, right? People who are like us. And when they're not like us, and they display behavior that is antithetical to what we might do, or even just slightly different than what we would choose to do, we want to quickly dismiss them, label them as difficult. And I think that's the other thing I really try to pay attention to in the book is, are we labeling people, or are you labeling the difficult person difficult out of bias? I've certainly done that myself, and I know we're all prone to do that. So those are important questions to ask yourself. The chapter on the biased coworker, it's the longest chapter. Yes. It's still inadequate. There's so much wonderful advice out there about how to deal with someone who's exhibiting microaggressions toward you, is making decisions that undermine you or challenge you unnecessarily, underestimate you. One of the things I think that's really important, and it's the only chapter in the book where I don't encourage the reader to ask what you might be doing to contribute to the problem. Because most, with a passive, we'll go back to passive aggressive for a moment, it may be that you've made it clear it's not safe to disagree with you, right? It may be that when they behave passive aggressively, you behave passive aggressively right back, right? It takes two to tango often. With the biased coworker, there is nothing that you are doing other than your own existence is creating that difficult behavior. And, I want to make clear, and this is something I've learned from Ruchika over and over, which is that it's not on you to fix the systemic biases that exist that have created that behavior. And yet I also don't want you to have to wait 100 years while we dismantle the patriarchy or systemic racism to actually be able to take action. And so it's really up to you as the target of that bias to decide how, when, and if to address it. And I hope the chapter has some tools for doing that. I'll share one, which Dolly Chugg, who's a friend of ours and a professor at NYU, actually has a new book out last month. Wonderful person, taught me this tactic, which is to ask what she calls a clueless question. So someone says, "Oh, I'm surprised you're here. You're a mom. I thought you'd be home by now," right? Something I've heard before. And say, "Oh, that's interesting. Do you think moms don't work late?" And it's that they're exhibiting bias, and what you really want to say is, I'm sorry, that was incredibly rude to assume that I would need to be home with my child instead of doing my job. But instead asking a clueless question that requires them to reflect on why did they say that? What inspired that? Or even the clueless question might be, I'm sorry, did I hear you? What did you just say? Right, and just have them repeat it, and having them have to repeat it. And my tone is a little snarky right now. I do encourage more of a neutral tone if you can find it in you, not turn into the passive aggressive peer while you're trying to address the biased coworker. But and that's just one of the tactics. The other, I think, is also really sometimes enlisting allies, right? And asking people, and I had this happen with a coworker, an Asian American woman who said, I feel like I get questioned much more than you in meetings. And to be honest, as a white woman, I didn't even notice it. I was super grateful she felt comfortable pointing it out, raised my awareness. As soon as she raised my awareness, I was like, holy cow, this is happening regularly. And she said, can you help give me credentials? Can you help bolster my ideas and my thoughts in these meetings, which was very easy for me to do. It didn't take much effort at all, and did counter some of the bias that obviously didn't fix it, but countered some of it in those moments. I do have to give Ruchika a lot of credit here. I actually wrote this article right after the 2016 election. We won't mention his name, but we were getting a lot of questions about what do you say when someone says something offensive at work. And I wrote an article about I think it was called How to Respond to an Offensive Comment at Work. And it was very well received when it came out. And then about 2 years later, I started getting comments on Twitter and other social media saying, this article is racist. You're putting the onus on the target of the discrimination to respond to it. And I remember, actually, it was my first trip to Seattle, 2019. Ruchika and I had a delicious Vietnamese lunch at Ba Bar. Was that where was I? And I said, can I ask you what you would do about this? And she said, I see the issue. I see why people are saying that. And I readdressed the article. I interviewed Ruchika. I interviewed another expert, Tina Opie, who's a professor at Babson. And each pair allowed me to adjust the article to change that tone, that article became the basis for this chapter. And Ruchika really helped me understand the ways as a white woman that I was missing a lot of the way that bias was showing up, and also the way that bias was showing up in the advice that many folks were giving people who were targets of bias. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for also creating a culture where talking about and having difficult conversations is acceptable and really in the limelight, because we are surrounded, especially, like to the point of the person who said, how did you write such a timely book? But it really feels more fraught than ever, right? Yeah. More fraught than ever, that you might be working with someone whom otherwise is, a wonderful person. You're having you're working together. It feels like you're working together effectively, but then you go home at night and you have those sleepless nights. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the advice, and especially the advice given to women, to people of color, people with other marginalized identities, is just it doesn't matter. Get a thicker skin. And actually, at no point in your book did I ever feel like you were telling me to grow a thicker skin or get a thicker skin, right? What I got was here are tools. It's important to address that this is happening. Don't invalidate it in yourself. And I feel like that was something that was definitely said to a lot of us, especially people who grew up outside this country, just stick and move, keep on moving. And I really appreciate that you say, no, it is having difficult conversations and dealing in situations where there are conflict and dealing with it and having tools is really necessary. Yeah. Was there anything in the book, or not even was there anything, were there moments when you were writing the book and researching that really surprised you? Was there advice or even situations that that you wrote about in the book. What surprised you as you were doing that?
Well, I mean, I heard some, there are a couple of things. One, the stories I heard from people of what they had to endure and it's even things that I think most of us would think are somewhat trivial. Like the guy who went on vacation and his coworker just took over his desk while he was on vacation, right? Which sounds sort of minor. You're like, well, that, or silly, right? But then it's like, wait, you acted as if I didn't exist, right? It is, and that's the thing I think that I had a hunch that this was really hitting a nerve for many people, those sleepless nights. I don't think I understood the extent that many people felt dehumanized by the behavior of their colleagues. So that was surprising. I think the depth of the pain that people were feeling, I interviewed close to 50 different people whose names all have been changed for the book, and the depth of the pain and hurt they felt, I don't think I appreciated going in. And I also, the number of researchers that the book is, I don't do primary research myself. Most of it is translation of academics' research, trying to translate into some practical advice. And how many people are researching this, I think, is also an indication of how widespread these reactions, these incidents are, that there are more and more people who are drawn to actually do research about this. Is an indication of how much people really, how many of us experience this. And I haven't, when you tell people the title of your book is called Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People, it is amazing how people go, oh, I need that, right? And I have yet to meet someone say, I've never worked with a difficult person, right? It's just so universal. I will say one other, this isn't the question you asked, but the other thing that's been surprising since the book has come out, so I'll tell you, the manuscript when I handed it in was way too long. It would have been like a brick this big if we actually published that original manuscript. And each of the archetype chapters included a section, if this is you. So if you're the passive-aggressive peer, right? If you're the tormentor. We cut those all out because of length. I still have them. That might be my next book.
Next book.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Although asking an author what their next book is when they're at this point is a little bit like asking a woman who's just given birth when she's having her next child. No, thank you. But we cut it all out for length, and we rationalized. I remember very clearly my editor, Jeff, who's wonderful. He said, do we think people really have the self-awareness? Like, who's going to actually read this chapter and be like, oh, that's me? I cannot tell you how many people have reached out to me and said, I am chapter 4. I am the insecure boss. I am the passive-aggressive peer. And that is, I hope I had a little bit of hand in that, because that is also one of the themes of the book, is that every one of us has worked with a difficult person, and I guarantee every one of us has been the difficult person. And I really try to normalize that. Like, in terms of identifying, there's the chapter, the know-it-all. I'm like, that was me. Like, yep, or that I can't even use was. That is me, And so I do think that that's something I'm was very surprised about, that people were willing to say that. In fact, I did a webinar recently where I did these online polls, and I asked people to identify if they had to put themselves in the category of a difficult person. And most of them chose passive-aggressive peer and know-it-all, which are pretty minor. But I also have an archetype called the tormentor, which is someone you expect to be a mentor, but they actually do the opposite and they undermine you. And like 3 people, it was all anonymous, but 3 people put themselves in that category. I was like, good for you for recognizing that. Like, also, get some help. Those are bad behaviors. Yeah.
That's hilarious. We are going to start taking questions shortly. And for folks who haven't read the book yet, I know you're definitely all on your way out to buy it after we're done. I want to talk about the 8 archetypes. I actually want to mention them so that especially if folks have specific questions. So the book is structured around 8 archetypes, each representing a common type of difficult person: the insecure boss, the pessimist, the victim, the passive-aggressive peer, which I know we have spent time on, the know-it-all, the tormentor who you'd hoped would be a mentor, the biased coworker, and the political operator. I don't see. People in the room are like, I wonder which one I am. All right.
You're none of them. No, I can guarantee
Listen. Listen.
Okay, wait, actually, wait. Can I
am
ask
all
you?
of them.
Can I ask you?
I have been all of them. I mean,
okay, but
my
wait.
husband is live streaming in today, and let me tell you,
He's
he would
nodding.
be like, hello.
He's like, yes, all of
all of them.
No, really, is there one you identify with more than one?
I've been the passive aggressive peer, although I have to say, Seattleites, I mean, I moved here 9.5 years ago. It is challenging to be around passive aggressive Seattleites. You have no idea. You have no idea where you stand. And I moved from the East Coast, which felt really direct and good in a good way. So I would say probably a little bit of that has come into me. The victim, I think I do that sometimes. I have definitely been the biased coworker. I have definitely been the biased coworker. And as I both write and believe and talk about, we all have bias. Yeah. I have bias too. And I have made huge mistakes too. I think the one I'm very curious about, and that was going to be my question, and a reminder, folks, especially those of you live streaming in as well as in the room, you can send questions anonymously in, or there are mics up front, and I will let you know when you can come up and do that and ask Amy your questions. But I'm really curious about the political operator. Yeah. Could you kind of talk a little bit about that? I think it's one of those where, like, again, like difficult, like everyone knows what difficult means, and then it's like everyone's got their own definition. Same with people who are political, you know. What does the political operator mean?
Yeah, I heard a lot of like sighs when she said the political operator. And it's not one that people ask a lot of questions about, so thank you for asking about it. So maybe it's because of the last chapter, maybe people haven't gotten to it yet. But the political operator is the person who cares incredible amounts about their career and getting ahead and does not care who they have to step on to get where they want to go. I talk in the chapter about good office politics versus bad office politics, and they definitely play the bad version. It's not bad to participate in office politics. In fact, there's lots of reasons we should know how to actually get work done, how to use our relationships to move things forward. But when you do so at the expense of others is when you sort of start to fall into this category. And it's, to talk about bias, we also have to be aware of who's allowed to play office politics. When we think about those narrower ranges of behavior, we often penalize women, people of color, for participating in those politics, partly because I think we'd think, well, you shouldn't know how the inner workings actually work. Like, these back channels are not for you. So that's something to keep in mind. And the political operator really, steals credit. That's one of their favorite modes of operation. Stealing credit, they often lie. That's partly saying I did this thing where I didn't, or they'll say I'll do this thing but they have no intention of doing it. And so often a lot of the advice in that chapter is really direct, partly because the political operator, because they're so good at manipulating the system, it's hard to use indirect methods with them. So, you might, when they stand up at the all staff meeting and say, I did this and I did that, right? Then following up and saying, in that staff meeting, you took credit for the team's project. I'm just curious, were you not interested in acknowledging the other people who were involved, or what motivated that? Again, asking questions that get them to reflect on the behavior. One of my favorite tactics, and I actually don't remember who suggested it, but one of the academics I interviewed did, which is to ask them for advice on how to play office politics. And the logic on this is fascinating, right? So if I go to my political operator and say, you're really good at navigating office politics, do you have any advice for me? Because, now,
Sounds like a burn.
it does sound like a burn, but the truth is they are good at it. And the political operator is usually getting ahead, and they're not going to say, oh, you have to step on everyone's head to get there, right? Like, they're not going to sit there and tell you all the horrible things. It's going to cause them to reflect on, what do I do, right? And chances are they're playing some version that's also a good version, right? It's not all bad. So it forces them to reflect on, what is it I'm actually good at that I would tell someone else to also do. Now, it could backfire, and they could say, got to be really manipulative, right? And they give you horrible advice. And you also don't want to compliment them to the point they're like, oh, this behavior is clearly condoned, right? But ask in a way that highlights that there's some things that they're good at that you want to learn from. That's one of those tactics that's a little risky. So, and I try to be clear about that. There's some tactics that are risky, and with all of the archetypes, like, as I mentioned, this sort of menu of tactics, you have to treat this as an experiment, because there's no 5-step process to dealing with the political operator or the biased colleague. You have to say, okay, I'm going to try out this tactic for 2 weeks and see how it works, or I'll try it out once and see, does it not, is it effective or is it not? How do I tweak? Maybe it works in this situation. It works in meetings, but not in one-on-ones. Or maybe it works when the boss is in the room, but it doesn't when they're not. So, and you have to continuously update your approaches so that you're, finding both what's effective, but also what you can feel good about. Because at the end of the day, I'm sure this is not news to any of you, but you can't control another person. Maybe we've all figured that out by now. But a lot of when I was writing the book, I was like, what I would give to be able to open up my colleague's brain, rewire everything, close it back up and say, okay, let's have that conversation again. But I can't do that. So what I can change is the way I react, what I say, my own behaviors, and at the end of the day, I want to feel like I lived according to my values in that relationship, even if they don't change at all, even if nothing happens, because I can't force them to do that.
I love that. Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Cheers for that. So I have a comment, and then I have my last question, and then the chat online is blowing up, as well as I'm going to start. So I'm trying to do all the things and keep everyone on track. So you wrote this one, in your sort of conclusion at the end, you wrote this, a couple of sentences, which I was like, yes, thank you so much. You gave, obviously, awesome, amazing research-backed advice, but you also wrote, through it all, don't lose sight of the need to prioritize yourself, your health, and your career. It's easy to get swept up in conflict with a coworker, and I feel like you could even write with a partner, with a friend, with a parent. But it's easy to get swept up in conflict with a coworker and spend your time focused on them. But your well-being is always critically important. Yeah. And I'm really glad you wrote that, because again, a lot of books, or even just advice on this topic, is so much just focused on, navigate, let it go, it's no big deal. And it's no, it really does. It can overtake your life, but it's the reminder that no, we are much more than that, right? And so, Amy, for all of you who haven't heard haven't heard the Women at Work, an award-winning podcast from Harvard Business Review, you've interviewed just experts on gender and gender dynamics. Do women, this is a bit of a controversial question, but do women have a harder time both navigating difficult coworkers, as well as are some of us more prone to be difficult coworkers than? Yeah. And I know I acknowledge I'm using gender as a binary here.
Yeah, and I think there's no research to support that. So let me just make that clear. There's no research to support that we are more difficult, or that there is research to show, however, that we have we are penalized for doing certain things, like asserting ourselves, for negotiating on our behalves, even for advocating on behalf of other women. We get penalized. So there's, I think there's I hate to even say this, but there's a stronger imperative for women to figure out some of these tactics, because it's just more difficult to navigate when you are facing one of these issues. And and I will say the other thing. I'm so glad you mentioned that about taking care of ourselves. Read that section, because one of the things I've learned from being on that podcast is that when people are on the receiving end of bias, we often encourage people when they're dealing with difficult people or having a conflict. And I did this for a long time when I was talking about my first book, The HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, as I encourage people, give that person empathy, right? Give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure many of you work in organizations where one of your organizational values is give the benefit of the doubt. And at some point I was like, oh, this does not work for people who are from underestimated groups. And asking someone to give empathy or the benefit of the doubt for someone who is dehumanizing them is an unfair request. However, the act of giving, and actually I make this very clear in that same chapter that Ruchika was reading from, is give empathy to yourself first. If you have some left over, maybe give it to the other person. And if you do give it to the other person, it's not an act of generosity, it's a strategic move. So it is beneficial to you to think of them, put yourself in their shoes, to see things from their perspective, not to necessarily soften your stance to them, but actually it makes you in a more collaborative, open mindset, so that when you do choose to address, in whatever way you choose to address the behavior, you are much more collaborative in doing so. And it actually gives you more freedom from the story you might be hooked into about yourself and that coworker, by expanding what the reality might be of that situation. You're able to think of more solutions. You're able to be more nimble, more agile in those conversations. So to the extent that I request you give empathy to anyone who falls into these patterns of behavior, it's a strategic move, it's not a generosity move.
I love that. That's so great. Great questions coming in online on the chat, and there is a mic here up front for anyone who wants to ask a question live. Please do ask the question on the mic so that everyone can hear. So one of the questions online is, thank you for your podcast and book. Really appreciate how your friendship and respect for Amy Bernstein, who is your co-host on the Women at Work podcast, comes through as you talk through very timely and important issues for working women. Could you talk about how you formed the podcast partnership with Amy B? And what I'm hearing in this question beyond just the podcast is, there are difficult people, and then what does it take to actually form a collaborative, collegial, good, not difficult relationship with a coworker?
Yeah, and this is a point I make in the book, and I think, and I did a talk with Stanford. They have a series called Masters of Creativity. I did a talk with them last week, and it was Zoom bombed, which it's never actually happened to me. It was awful. It was Zoom bombed in one of the worst ways. Really, really awful. But the way we the person who was organizing, the way we came out of it was like, okay, let's drown out this negativity with positivity, which is such a good metaphor, because the chances are, when you think about the negative coworkers you've had or the difficult coworkers you've had, I'm guessing they loom super large in your mind, but you've probably had many, many more positive or at least neutral relationships with coworkers. And those are not the ones that we ruminate about at 3 a.m. So I do think really leaning into the positive relationships you have, and honestly, my relationship with Amy Bernstein, who we call Amy B on the podcast, Amy G, Amy B, is an incredibly positive relationship in my entire career. And I really owe that the collaboration we formed, we really owe to our podcast producer, whose name is Amanda Kersey. She doesn't get nearly enough credit for the podcast as Amy B. and I do, but she has created this environment in which it's very safe to make mistakes, right? We're very edited on the podcast, so we say things we don't. She thinks later on she'll go, "I want you to listen to this. Do you hear?" I'm going to play it back. "Do you want me to put that in the podcast?" And you're like, "Oh no, I don't want you to put that in the podcast." But she gives us, instead of just cutting it out, she gives us a chance to hear it. She gives us a chance to make mistakes. The other wonderful thing is Amy B is, I think, 11 years older than me. Amanda's about 11 years younger than me. So we also have this cross-generational relationship where we're in very different life experiences. Amanda is a caretaker for her mother. Amy B identifies as a lesbian who doesn't have children. I'm identify as a straight woman who's married to a man who has a child. So we're bringing all of these different experiences to bear. And over the years, we've had many different other co-hosts who've since left HBR who also are bringing different things to it. So I do think it's just this environment of sort of safety and experimentation, and we're getting, it's such a privilege to be able to interview women who both are experiencing some of the struggles that we talk about, but also research the struggles we talk about, and then to reflect on what does that mean for us, right? And that space to be experimental, but also reflective on what does this mean for us as individuals. And as the mom of a teenage daughter, I often think, what does this mean for my daughter? But then also thinking, like, Ruchika's been on the podcast many times, like, what does this mean for the life of an immigrant here in the U.S.? Or what does this mean for a Black woman who is the only in her organization? I could talk about the podcast for a long time, you can tell. But it's one of my favorite projects to work on, and I really appreciate the question.
Yeah, it's a great podcast. And I think over the years, a lot of the advice that you've both given on the podcast and the people you've interviewed have really set us up for some of these conversations. And I think this is, again, something I learned from you, which is having difficult conversations and sort of even having like conflict-filled conversations doesn't have to be a bad thing. Yes. It has to be done effectively. Yeah. Right?
Yes. And one of the most popular articles I've written for HBR is called "Why We Should Be Disagreeing More at Work." That's right. Which you might think is antithetical to this book, but they're very much connected, which is that I don't think we actually openly disagree, dissent, debate enough, especially in a work context where we have this high expectation for harmony. And harmony is the killer of innovation. It's the killer of inclusion, which you might also seem antithetical, but in fact, you cannot have, and Ruchika and I talk about this all the time, you cannot have an inclusive work environment without sort of the basic skills for having difficult conversation. Right? In creating inclusion requires struggling with really hard topics. And if you can't have those conversations, you're not going to create that environment.
Yeah. Hear, hear. Seriously. I completely agree. And there's this excellent question online. In fact, there's so many. Again, the mic is open if anyone,
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, I promise. Yeah. We will be kind.
Yes. You know what? I just thought of something else I wanted to say about the podcast, because now we're just going to talk about the podcast, which is that the other thing is it also allows us, encourages us to have difficult conversations, but also encourages us to talk about things that often aren't talked about.
That's right.
And we actually did an episode on menopause.
Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking of
yes,
those.
Yes, and I have a family member in the audience. We went out to dinner beforehand, and she's in her 20s, and I talked about menopause the entire dinner, I think, because now I feel like completely emboldened, and I'm like, why did no one ever talk to me about this? Why didn't everyone tell me how this would impact my career, and how I would be perceived at work as a middle-aged woman, and why has no one ever even mentioned a hot flash in a meeting when we're clearly all having hot flashes. Like, I don't understand. So now I feel so emboldened to just be like, let's talk about menopause. And I do, that is one of the things that's been a gift to me, and I hope to our listeners.
Yes.
And, we just did this episode also on weight bias at work, which was, I knew it was a problem, and I had no idea how big of a problem it was. I recommend listening to the podcast, and we really only scratched the surface, because the impact of weight bias at work is especially for women. In fact, the stats actually on obese men is actually that they earn more than normal weight men, whereas the wage or the pay penalty for women who are obese is double digits compared to normal weight women. And that's just the financial impact. There's so much. Yeah. So much more.
I remember I was like walking down the street in Philadelphia trying to get coffee, listening to that episode, and I was like bawling on the streets, and I was like, Amy, thank you so much for this. It was really amazing, wonderful episode. I mean, like all of them, but especially that one. Okay, so a question before we get carried away and have the Amy and Ruchika show all night long. Passive aggression and conflict avoidance are frequently rewarded in workplaces or are more likely to fly under the radar. Mm-hmm. White supremacy culture also reinforces other kind of difficult people archetypes. What are your general thoughts on navigating difficult people within a system that rewards them for being difficult?
Oh, gosh.
I know.
So the advice I want to give, and I would just give it because it's not, is if you were in a system, well, I'll give it and then I'll completely caveat it, which is if you are in a system that rewards that difficult behavior, my first instinct is get out of that system.
Yeah.
So I think about toxic workplaces, and I intentionally don't use the word toxic in the book because I think that describes extreme behavior, which is also pretty prevalent, but is not going to be addressed by the tactics I share, partly because what we know from the research is that people who do qualify as toxic, or even workplaces that qualify as toxic, really aren't that reformable. And so removing yourself from those, I'm sorry, I hear some serious disappointment. And partly because the system does reward it. Now, I caveat that behavior. I caveat that advice because we all work in a system that rewards this behavior because we live in a society that reinforces the patriarchy and white supremacy. So yes, we're reinforcing some of these behaviors over and over. And I think we have to recognize that. And I'm very, very grateful to the work of people like Ruchika who are focusing on the system level changes that need to happen while I'm really focused on the interpersonal. Oftentimes I'm giving stopgap tactics for handling a relationship within a system that doesn't care whether that relationship is positive or not, and might even benefit from that relationship not being positive. And yet I do want to give people tools that can help them sleep better at night, develop what I call in the book interpersonal resilience, which is that you feel less stress when you're in those difficult interactions and you bounce back from them more quickly, which I do think the tools in the book do.
Yeah. And there's this wonderful quote I go back to quite often by Indra Nooyi, the first female CEO of PepsiCo, former, who said, "You can never overinvest in communication skills." And I do want to give a shout out to my dear friend, Dr. Akin Yeshin, who is in the audience, who leads the communication leadership program at the University of Washington, and shout out to all students in the program with us here today as well. And just the importance of investing in communication skills is something that really came through in your book, right? Yeah. And if there was, as we're thinking about wrapping up, as we get to sort of the last 7 or 8 minutes of tonight, is there like a communication tactic that is almost like the overarching, something that we could, boil it down to?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that is a good
I know it's a tough
question.
one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, I will. So let me ease my way into it. And I just have to say, the mic is right here. I can't believe none of
Yes.
you have questions. I refuse
We're-
to believe it. I think
we're-
you're being shy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
woo!
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. So I will ease my way into answering that question. See, it just took one person. Which is that. Oh wait, remind me of the question
Yeah,
because I was
so
so excited.
I know we got
I was
so excited that people
yeah.
stood up. What is so? If there was like
One
the
communication,
communication
yes.
skill tactic.
Okay,
yeah.
so this is not a tactic. This is an awareness, which is that I believe so much of our struggles with other humans is about the tension between getting my needs met and getting their needs met, and I do think we have a responsibility when we are in relationship with another person, whether that's a transactional relationship, buying my coffee. Where did we go to coffee? It was so good.
Oh.
Vita.
Oh, Cafe
Yeah,
Vita
Yeah,
today.
Cafe Vita. Right. Whether I'm in Cafe Vita and it's just a transactional situation, or whether it's a coworker, or whether it's a family member who you're going to be maybe in relationship for decades with, is that you do have a responsibility to think both about how do I make sure my needs are met and how do I make sure their needs are met. And I think that's, for me, that awareness informs my communication of like, how do I both say what I need and listen for what they need? And I'm evolving to be able to do that every day, because it's not easy to do. So that's not actually a specific tactic.
great.
It's more of an awareness. The other thing I will tell you, as someone who deals a lot with conflict, telling someone else they need to calm down.
Ooh.
Like, just don't do that. No one in the history of difficult conversations has ever calmed down because you told them to. And so, that indicates a larger, there's a lot of communication talks about owning your own emotions, owning your responsibility, using I statements instead of you statements, or we statements instead of you statements. And I think that is incredibly important as well. No one likes to be assigned thoughts, behaviors, feelings they don't actually think they have. So one of the first tactics in the passive-aggressive chapter is do not call someone passive-aggressive, because that will just encourage them to be more so, right? And it's true with all those labels.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Question number 1.
Sure. Well, thank you for this book. I came in part tonight because I've been told I'm a difficult person, right? And I'm not sure, I haven't read it yet, but I'm probably sure I fall into the know-it-all archetype. But
The first person on the mic is always a know-it-all, by the way.
right. So, one, yes, keenly interested in the self-assessment tool. Would definitely pay extra for the add-on, so I can do some more inner work.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what I'm trying to relate this to, and again, I haven't read the book yet or listened to the podcast, but taking notes, a lot of it seems geared towards relating individual to individual. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to navigate is the broader organization. Sure. When I'm dealing with a lot of passive aggressive, insecure bosses and political operatives in my work environment. But my question is, because I will keep it to a question,
Yes.
This is town hall, right?
Yes.
Is how in this Zoom, post-remote work, and sometimes hybrid work environment where so much of our communication is over email. How can we then break some of this stuff down when this face-to-face element or opportunity for connection and add empathy and benefit of the doubt
Great
oftentimes is
question.
missing?
Yeah,
Thank you
great
so
question.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I will tell you, I do not feel like a human when I am a little tiny box on a screen. And I can't imagine, we're very good at seeing other people as humans when they're little tiny boxes on a screen. So part of the challenge of the past few years has not only been, it's been very dehumanizing the way we interact, and even if I take emotion out of it, it's also just very flat. Like, we don't have context. We don't, we're not picking up on there's such interesting research about how quickly people can pick up on whether there's a fight happening in a room when they walk in a room when nothing's being said, right? They know right away just from the way there's like the energy in the room, but the way people are holding their body language. You're missing all of that context, which requires us to be much more intentional about the way we communicate. I have a colleague who sends emails now that says, at the top, my intention with this email is blah, 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 blah. And then there's the email, which is such a brilliant way to do it because it takes out, how many times do you open an email and go, well, this is what they really wanted, right? Or this is what they're saying, or that was passive aggressive, what they really, but by stating the intention up front, it's just very clear. And it also doesn't allow for, well, it still allows for misinterpretation, but that opportunity for misinterpretation is narrower because you've made your intention clear. So I just think we have to find ways to be more deliberate about how we communicate. The other thing about the past few years is the amount of grief, anxiety, stress that we are all under. You do not have to know anything about neuroscience to know that our brains don't function well and we are not our best selves. And so we're showing up depleted, anxious, upset, and often not even about what's happening at work. And so I just think we need to be aware of that I'm not showing up as my best self, my colleagues are not showing up as their best selves. Can I give myself some grace? Can I give others some grace in these interactions? And the most important thing, because we quickly tell ourselves a story when we get that text or that Slack message or that email about why they sent it, what they meant. And can you just ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm not seeing this correctly? Right? Just sort of trying to interrogate the stories you're telling yourself before you decide how to react. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. All right. We're down to the last 4 minutes and 2 questions. So
Okay. We'll do
please
rapid.
keep it to a question and it's rapid fire response.
Okay, I'll try to make it brief.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about intercultural communications.
It's great.
I grew up in Israel. I came in my 20s to this country. And Israel is very much in your face, very direct communications. I came to Minnesota.
Oh, boy.
And I came, and the last 32 years I spent in Seattle.
Yeah.
It's a very nice culture.
Nice.
In the last exactly.
But not kind.
In the last 2 weeks, I encountered somebody across the table from me in a business relationships that was very much in my face and kind of being very aggressive. And my immediate reaction was to be my old Israeli self, just to give him a piece of my mind.
Yeah.
But at the same time, everybody else around me is nice. Where do you take that?
Oh,
Great question.
Yes. My first book, when I was the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, I called. Thank you. I'm trying to answer this very quickly. I called Erin Meyer, who's written a wonderful book called The Culture Map. She looks at the cultures on different spectrums. One of which is confrontational to non-confrontational. Israel's about here on the confrontational. I would guess Seattle's about here on the non-confrontational. And I asked her, I said, how do you deal when you have a team of multicultural people from different cultures, which style do you default to? And I said, can you say, okay, this is my style, what's your style? And she said, no, you've never said anything more American than that, right? There's so many cultures where that would just be antithetical. You can't do that. So it is in the same way that we're constantly navigating how do I meet my needs and how do I meet their needs, you're constantly negotiating which conflict style are we going to use. And pretty much we often, it's what we see in the research is that we defer to the dominant culture, meaning the culture we exist in, so that might be the Seattle culture, or even if it's, I actually have worked with an organization where lots of Israelis, even though it's an American company, and it's a much more confrontational style. So you have to really pay attention, and this is where your social awareness, one of the emotional intelligence skills, comes in of like, what's acceptable here, what's effective. Let me try a little bit of my little bit of Israeli confrontational, see how it goes. Ooh, didn't go well. Okay, let me draw back a little bit. But it's sort of a constantly paying attention to how it's received, trying different tactics. It's exhausting, but I wish that there was a nice way to be like, we roll the dice, here's the confrontation style we're using today. But it's really about using those emotional intelligence skills and remembering when we're defining difficult people, culture is a major issue in how people choose to behave, what they feel comfortable in terms of exhibiting their behavior, and keep that in mind that they may this what you see as aggression or what you see as passive aggressiveness may be very appropriate in the culture they're from, and to keep that in mind.
Thank you.
That was probably more than 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
And the last question. Thank you so
Make
much.
it a good one.
Thanks so much for the stimulating conversation. I feel like you partly answered this about style and culture, because I think I can apply to organizations as well.
Yeah.
But I work for a social services organization, work for the state, and we've taken courses in like nonviolent communication and things like about communicating thoughts, values, and feelings with groups. And then I take that outside that, like some of those tactics to other groups, and I get like, I can tell you're doing this, like, I know how you feel thing with me, and like, it's not gonna work, you know? Like, and maybe that falls into one of the archetypes that you talk about in that way. And I haven't read the book yet, I'm really curious about some of the tactics, but how do we navigate this kind of stylistic thing in different areas that embody some of those values that could be very effective, but don't necessarily apply, or people are actually looking for them to be antagonistic with? So.
Yeah, I think there's like 40 different answers I could give you, but I'm gonna try one since we have 2 minutes. And I think there's so much in what you're talking about. One, I will say that mission-driven organizations, in my experience, and anecdotally working with many different, actually have a lot more conflict.
Yes.
Partially because my theory is that they change the work around communication because they believe mission trumps all else. And they believe we actually all agree about the mission, right? We all agree about the mission, so they don't look at other differences that might be coming into play. Differences in work style, differences in cultural background. So that's just one thing I will say. The other is, I'm married to a therapist, and I can't tell you how many times I say, stop therapizing me. But his response, which is really helpful, and for the people who are like, I see what you're doing, is say, yeah, I am using a tactic, but I'm using it because it's effective. Would you be willing to entertain me just for a minute and let me say it this way? And just sort of, instead of like, I'm trying to manipulate, because I think what happens is people are like, you're manipulating me. And there are tactics in here that I think if you used in a certain way, people would be like, I know what you're doing, and I'm not falling for it. But you can say, yeah, I'm using this. I read this great book by Amy Gallo, and I'm using this tactic. But I'm using this tactic because it's been proven to be effective. Would you just engage in it with me for a few minutes? And the other thing is, I say this about any sort of behavioral change, rather than saying, from now on, we're going to do this. Because now on sounds like a really long time. But it's saying, like, you know what, in this one conversation, let's try this. Can we just give it a try? We'll see how it works. If it doesn't work, we won't do it again. Or this 1 week, can we do this in our meetings? See how it goes. Present everything as an experiment. People are much more willing to try something out for a short term. So again, say, let's just try it for this conversation, entertain me. If it doesn't work, we won't use it. And then guess what? It'll work. And they'll be like, oh, let's do that again. Next week, they'll be like using it on you. And you'll say, I see what you're doing there. So.
That was last week.
Yeah, exactly.
Good suggestion, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Amy, I could talk to you all night. We've been together all day already. But unfortunately, we do have to wrap up this party. So thank you so much to all of you in person. Thank you so much to all of you streaming in. And thank you, Amy, for tonight. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. A reminder, the book is available for sale, unfortunately not in person today, but certainly online.
And there's a QR code.
And there's a QR code where you can purchase it.
And it's discounted, I think, if you use that code.
Is it? Okay,
I think
wonderful.
so.
It's discounted, I believe.
Who
And
doesn't
if
love
not,
a discount?
It's still worth every penny. Wonderful book. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.